everybody. This is Maggie from the Positude PowWOW, and tonight I have on as a very special guest, Michael T. McCrae. Michael has written a few books, but the one that I was shown to read by a friend of mine, Cracks of Hope, Stories and Snapshots of Divided Lands, really moved me. He partnered with Texas Christian University on a project called Stories of Reconciliation, spent a semester traveling throughout Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. And in his journey, he was able to get stories, individual stories from people who were in these war-torn countries. And the photographs that go along with these stories, the pictures truly tell 1,000 words. So this story, this Cracks of Hope, Stories and Snapshots of Divided Lands, really touched me and moved me. And so it drew me to contact Michael to talk not only about work, but also some other projects that he's been working on in a couple of his books, because I feel that his message is very important. He speaks about peace and love and kindness, and I feel that we all need a little bit more of that in this world. So, Michael, are you there?
I am indeed. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on today. So I guess the first question I would have for you is, how did you get started and what guided you into this path that you're following?
Yeah, well, as I was telling you earlier, I think my sense of vocation at the moment is facilitating transformative encounters through personal, authentic storytelling. And then even beyond that, about presenting a platform for the telling of stories that people rarely hear. And I think the roots of that were really in my childhood. I grew up in a really small town in East Tennessee. My dad I live in Nashville, by the way, so I'm down here in the South. And my dad was a family practice physician in a small federally qualified health center. And my family was really big into storytelling since as long as I can remember, especially my dad's mother. She's been kind of the keeper of the family stories and of our travels around the world and of her upbringing and my granddad's upbringing. And I grew up with just sort of immersed in storytelling. But then when I was in middle school and high school, my dad was his health clinic was welcoming college students from Nashville who would come in for spring break to kind of get a sense of rural healthcare. And in the middle of that week, we would all meet at the clinic, and my dad would share with them some stories that he had written about really traumatic encounters with some of his patients. And he wrote these just deeply moving stories, and then he always wrote prayers afterwards, these kind of poetic expressions about how to speak to God and make sense of the stuff he was encountering doing this rural healthcare. And I remember just feeling deeply moved and influenced by these stories of my dad trying to give voice to the pain and suffering of the people around him. And I think without knowing exactly what was happening, I was being influenced at that time to be drawn toward the stories that people rarely hear, and to see that there are dominant narratives all around us that are often really ungenerous to people who are marginalized and people who are suffering, to people who don't have as powerful voices. I mean, I was a history major in college, and one of the things you learn very quickly is that history is written by the people who win, and you only get one version of the story that way. And I just found myself more and more compelled to use what privilege or what platform I had, because as a white male son of a doctor, in the United States, I have a lot of privilege, and so how do I use that well? And I think one of the ways that I can use it is by trying to amplify the stories and the voices of people, not people who are voiceless, because they do have powerful voices. It's just people who are silenced, who are ignored, who are neglected, who are pushed aside. And so and one of the ways that really took shape for me was getting involved in Israel and Palestine, because my family has been going over to the Holy Land now for 50 years. My granddad was an archaeologist and a New Testament professor, and started traveling there in 1967. I've personally made 10 trips there myself, and so I was traveling there as a kid, and of course was learning about that place in the midst of this ongoing conflict. And as I grew to care more and more about that place and its people, I therefore was developing a passion also for trying to be part of making that place healthier and more peaceful. And so this love of storytelling, this passion to tell the stories that aren't being heard, and this connection to Israel and Palestine all kind of came together and drove me toward this path of peace building. And so after college, I went and did some peace work in Israel and Palestine, and I wrote a book about that called Letters from Apartheid Street, a Christian peacemaker in occupied Palestine. And then I went on to do a master's degree in conflict resolution and reconciliation from Trinity College Dublin, and I did that program in their campus in Belfast, Northern Ireland, which was a place that was riddled with conflict for decades and decades, and studied reconciliation there, and came home and wrote a master's thesis on what we can learn about forgiveness from the stories of prisoners. And I spent several years volunteering in maximum security prison here in Nashville and really trying to amplify the stories of people who had been thrown away in prison. Unfortunately, I was banned from the prison in 2014 by the warden for trying to advocate on behalf of the prisoners' well-being. And so then I turned some of my attention to advocacy on the outside, and it's then taken me in a lot of different directions with storytelling. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you want. But I guess that's a long answer to say kind of how I got into this work in a broad way.
Oh, that's amazing. Very well-rounded too, I have to say. Yeah, I absolutely would like to hear more about your stories and the projects that you're working on. What would you say, though, was your most, well, obviously we know your most passionate interest, but what was your most touching story that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, wow. So many.
There are so many, right?
I'll back up and say it this way. So in 2015, I embarked on this storytelling project that you mentioned called Stories of Reconciliation, and I partnered with Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. And I'd spent about 2.5 months traveling through Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. And I interviewed about 50 different people on their stories and perspectives of reconciliation, justice, forgiveness. And a lot of what I was doing during that time was telling stories through Instagram. So I was taking pictures and then writing short stories that could fit in an Instagram caption. And that's what I turned into this ebook that you read called Cracks of Hope. I'm also working on writing a full-length book on that project. And the tentative title for that at the moment is The Stories That Just Might Save Us. The opening chapter of that book is about two men, one of whom is featured in Cracks of Hope. And a guy named Rami El-Hanan, who is an Israeli man whose grandparents, maybe parents, I think grandparents though, did not survived Auschwitz, were targets, of course, during the Holocaust. But unfortunately, his 14-year-old daughter, Smadar, didn't make it past the age of 14. She was killed in Israel by a Palestinian suicide bomber in, I believe, 1997 or 98. And Rami spoke to me about, the day that it happened and how he heard that there was a bomb. And of course, whenever you heard that there was a bomb during that time, I guess during any time, you immediately want to know where your children are. And so he and his wife began, running through the streets, he said, looking for Smadar, and they couldn't find her. And he said, so we finally decided we had to go to the morgue. And he said, it was there that you see the sight that you'll never forget for all of your life, and the finger of death is suddenly pointing right between your eyes. And he talked about how his world was blown up into 1,000 pieces at that moment when they saw that their daughter was in fact dead. And then Rami talked about going through in the Hebrew tradition, the Shiva, the 7 days of mourning, and where thousands of people were coming to his home to offer their condolences. And he said, we went through the 7 days of mourning, but then the 8th day came, and we had to decide what we were going to do on the 8th day. We had a choice. Are we going to pursue retaliation and revenge and hatred? Or are we going to try and use our pain to make a more peaceful world? And so he heard about this organization called the Parents Circle Families Forum, which is a group of Israeli and Palestinian bereaved people who are working together for reconciliation based on their common sense of loss, their common pain. They've both lost loved ones to this, and that he went to a meeting of this group and was just amazed at what he saw. And he's now actually the Israeli leader of that organization. But he talks about how, when something like this happens, when you lose a daughter, when you lose a loved one, you have a responsibility to do whatever you can, whatever is in your power, to make sure that nobody else ever feels the same pain. And so you have a man who in some ways has every right to want to get revenge, right? Who, if anyone has a right to perpetuate the conflict, it would be men and women like, Rami and his wife who have lost. But they're the ones who are saying, no, it's because we know the true cost of this conflict that we want to do everything we can to bring peace. And then on the other side of that, the other part of the chapter is a man named Bassam Aramin, who's a Palestinian man who spent 7 years in an Israeli prison when he was a teenager. And he was released in 1993 when the Oslo peace accords were signed, and he thought this was going to be a time of hope and stability and peace. And so he got married and he had kids because he felt like it was safe to do so. And I think he had 4 or 5 kids. And then several years ago, his 10-year-old daughter, Abir, was coming home from school one day in the West Bank, and an Israeli soldier shot her in the head and killed her on her way home from school. And so, here you have a man like Rami, whose daughter was killed by a Palestinian suicide bomber, and you have a Palestinian man, Bassam, whose daughter was killed by an Israeli soldier. And both of those men chose the path of forgiveness. They chose the path of reconciliation and a path of justice, to say we have to create a more just world where this kind of stuff doesn't happen. And these two men have since reached for each other as well. And they now will refer to themselves as closer even than brothers. And actually, where I'm sitting right now in my office, I have a series of 26 4x6 photographs up on my wall, what I call my cloud of witnesses, the people throughout history that inspire me. And one of those pictures is a picture of Rami and Bassam with their arms around each other, reminding me that even people who find themselves, whether by the accident of birth or by choice, on opposite sides of a deathly conflict, can, through even the worst of pain and the worst of division, reach for one another instead of reaching for the gun. So
that is so incredibly touching. Tremendous stories there. And as always, I continue to pray for the kind of work that you're doing.
Thank you.
For people to be able to come together and find peace and find the faith to continue on to create peace rather than to create conflict, especially in the times that we're living in now. I feel so very important.
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. That one hit me.
Yeah. I know.
All of your stories hit me.
Yeah.
All of your stories hit me, but wow.
And Bassam's story is not in Cracks of Hope. I spoke to him after that particular project. Rami's story is, but they're in this new book that I'm working on, their 2 stories together are the first chapter. And I'll, of course, keep you informed about the progress of that book. But you were asking me earlier about the other storytelling stuff that I was doing, and I can tell you just quickly about that here in Nashville, I really have 2 major projects that I'm working on. One is a free monthly community storytelling event that is called 10 by 9. And it started in Belfast, and I brought it to Nashville about 4 years ago. But it's where 9 people have up to 10 minutes each to tell a real story from their life based on a theme. And so for over 4 years now, we've been meeting every month. we usually have 100 to 120 people who come, and they just sit and listen to 9 people tell them true stories from their lives. Last month our theme was "Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time," which was a really fun theme. And a week from today, we do a theme called "When I Was Young." But we're going to have 4 of our storytellers be under the age of 20 and 5 be over the age of 65. So we have this intergenerational storytelling about stories of when we were young. So that's the kind of stuff that we do there. And it's just, it's not expressly about peace building. It's not expressly about anything except for having real people tell real stories. And we really make it clear that we're not about professional storytelling. We want ordinary people to have a chance to tell their ordinary stories. And so I really love that. It's all a volunteer thing. I've been doing it for free for 4 years. I just do it because I love it. So that continues on. And then more professionally, I'm working with an organization called Narrative 4. That's the number 4. You can find them at narrative4.com. And they're about 4 or 5 years old, a nonprofit that was really born from the wonderings of a group of really famous novelists like Colin McCann and Chimamanda Adichie and Reza Aslan and Terry Tempest Williams and Ron Rash and a bunch of other folks who kind of wondered, what is the ultimate goal of all this novel writing that we're doing? Why do we tell stories? And I think what they realized is we tell stories because we want to give people the opportunity to imagine the world through somebody else's experiences. And that's what novels can do, is you get into the world of a character, right? I mean, you start to see the world through their eyes. And so I think their conclusion was that the ultimate goal of storytelling is the building of empathy. And so they developed this methodology where you bring people together and pair these participants up. And so let's just say that you and I, Maggie, we're paired up. I would tell you a true story from my life. You would tell me a true story from your life. And we would come back together as a group. Let's just say there are 10 or 12 of us. We'd come back together. And when it was my turn to tell the story, I actually wouldn't tell my story. I would be telling your story, but I would do it in first person pronouns as if your story happened to me. So I would actually say, "Hi, my name is Maggie. And, when I was 7, this happened to," whatever it might be. And it's really kind of tricking the brain into empathy. And it's had remarkable success. In just 4 to 5 years, they have programs running in, I think, 10 to 15 U.S. states. They have programs in Mexico, Ireland, Israel, South Africa. And so I've been working over the last several months on building programs here in Nashville. And just actually on Saturday, I ran a story exchange where we had 5 people who were not born in the United States, folks from Bangladesh, India, Egypt, Mexico, Ethiopia. And they exchanged stories with 5 people who were born in the U.S. Because we're living in a time of heightened xenophobia, a time of fear of immigrants and refugees. And we wanted to bring together, immigrants with folks who were born here and say, don't just tell each other your stories, but inhabit each other's stories. And so, we had I had a white, Christian woman from Appalachia who was retelling the story of a conservative Muslim woman about coming to the United States and all the discrimination and hatred she has faced. And then I had this conservative Muslim woman who was telling a story where, on behalf of her partner, who talked about getting pregnant outside of marriage and struggling with whether or not to get an abortion and these sorts of things. And so, but this woman is telling this story as if it happened to her, and so it was. And the feedback afterward was just remarkable. People saying, the story I was telling of my partners, it was like that story could have happened to me. It wasn't even like it was my partner's story. It was like it was my own story. And friendships were developing, and people were exchanging contact information to get together later. And there was talk of trying to have a follow-up dinner in 6 months to get everyone back together and continue the conversation. And the home that we were hosting this in, the hostess said, I've had people from around the world come in through my house. I've had my family here, but what I just witnessed is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my living room. And I told the folks sitting there after the story exchange, I said, I want you to think about what has just happened. We're living in a moment where we are deeply afraid of anyone who doesn't look like us. We're living in a moment where we want to keep immigrants and refugees out. We want to put bans on people. We're living in a time where just last week, 30 minutes from Nashville, people who self-identify as neo-Nazis and white supremacists marched on a town just very close to us, holding signs that made a lot of people feel unwelcomed and feel threatened. And that's what's happening right now. But we had people from Ethiopia, Bangladesh, India, Egypt, Mexico, and here in the United States sit together in a room, share a meal, and tell each other the truth about our lives and our experiences. And we listen to each other so deeply that we could retell each other's stories as if they happened to us. And I said, I'm not being over dramatic when I tell you that I believe this is the stuff that will save the world. Like, this is how it happens. Margaret Mead once said, and I'm paraphrasing, but her quote was something like, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, because indeed it is the only thing that ever has. And I think that that's true. And I think that the work of saving the world is not going to be grand. It's not going to be, this kind of really flashy and fancy stuff. It is often the simple and yet difficult, beautiful work of bringing unlikely people together, even in living rooms, to eat together and to tell each other the truth about our experiences, and to listen with generosity and with care and with kindness. And I really do believe that that's the stuff that will save the world. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I'm most definitely of that mindset that this type of organization would just do so much in the way of creating peace. And what an innovative way to share perspectives, develop empathy, bridge cultural differences, spread cultural awareness, and most importantly, peace. I think that's just such an amazing project. I'm speechless. I've never heard of anything like this. It's so cool and so different and so effective at the same time. That's wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Where do you see yourself going? I know that you're working on some future projects. Would you like to talk about some of your previous books and what you have coming up, what you're planning to do?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the first book I did is Letters from Apartheid Street, and it's a series of stories and reflections about, it's a series of stories about what I was seeing while I was working as doing nonviolent direct action in Hebron, a Palestinian city in the West Bank. And it's also a series of reflections about kind of dealing with the question, Jesus, and I come from a Christian background, so Jesus said, love your enemies. And I don't think he meant that in kind of a fluffy way. I think when he's saying that, he's saying it to a group of people who are able to see Roman soldiers occupying their country every day, right? These are people for whom enemies were right there every day, walking down the street in their places of worship. It wasn't a theoretical idea. It was very practical. It had flesh, it had blood, it had armor on it. And so when I hear him say, love your enemies, I think he's meaning the people that you can see, the people that are right around you, you love them. And as I was working in the West Bank and I was seeing abuses constantly from Israeli soldiers against the Palestinians that I was around, then a lot of what I was wrestling with was, what does it mean then for me as a Christian to take Jesus seriously? What does it mean to love my enemies when I'm, seeing this Israeli soldier beating a developmentally disabled Palestinian child? What does it mean to love my enemy in that situation? So a lot of reflections about that. How do I be peaceable? How do I practice nonviolence? How do I remain faithful to the belief that there is the image of God in everyone? So that's what that book is about. And these are all on Amazon for those who might wish to read. And then I wrote another book called Where the River Bends, Considering Forgiveness in the Lives of Prisoners, and was really grateful to have Archbishop Desmond Tutu write the foreword to that book. That book grew out of the master's thesis that I did. But the idea was, there's a lot that's written on forgiveness, and yet almost nothing has been written about what people in prison think about forgiveness. And
Amen.
And that strikes me as, when I was realizing that, it struck me as very odd. And one way I could get it, because part of what we have done with prisons is make them kind of out of sight and out of mind. We just sort of throw people away behind bars, and then we don't ever think about them. So in one way, it doesn't surprise me that nobody seems to have thought to go to prison to talk to people about forgiveness. On the other hand, it is very strange, because people in prison have often given and received some of the worst harms that people ever experience in life. And they are living in a system that's built on unforgiveness, right? It's a system built on punishment. So what more appropriate place is there to talk about forgiveness? And so I knew that I had the possibility, the access to pull off a project that could begin to fill that gap. And my book doesn't come close to filling the gap, but it's a start. And I knew I could do that because I was a registered volunteer with the Tennessee Department of Corrections. I had been volunteering at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where Tennessee's death row is, for about 3 or 4 years. And so I knew that I could get into the prison. I knew that I had the trust of many of the men. And so, what the book does is it kind of creates what I called a map of the forgiveness terrain. What's a helpful way to think about forgiveness, to kind of navigate this terrain. And then I tell the reader 14 stories of people in prison, 7 men and 7 women, all in Tennessee. Most of the stories are in their own words. They're through interviews that I did with them. And then the last part of the book kind of looks at how do those stories fit into the map that we created in the first section. And in the very end of the book is an appendix. And there are 5 stories that I called From Behind Prison Walls, I think is what it's called. But I spent about a year volunteering as a prison chaplain, which actually didn't have a whole lot for me to do with kind of spiritual guidance or talking about God or Jesus or anything like that. I was asked to be a chaplain on the most violent unit of the prison because of my experience in violence de-escalation and conflict resolution. And so a good bit of my time was spent trying to keep men from cutting themselves with razors and trying to keep them from committing suicide or from, just trying to de-escalate violence.
Right.
So I have 5 stories in the back of the book about some of those violent encounters that I had with people. And I end each one with a prayer inspired by, as I told you before, what my dad did with the stories of his patients. And I wrote those prayers immediately after the events took place. I came home, I wrote the story, and I wrote the prayer as a way of saying, what I have experienced, what I have seen in that prison is nothing short of hell. It is hell for the people who live there. And how then, when we think about God often as the antithesis of hell, how do you pray to God when you're in hell? And that's kind of what the exercise was for me. How do I talk to God when I'm standing in the middle of hell? And so I've got those 5 stories there. So those are the 2 books that I currently have out. I just got an email from a publisher saying that my next one is being copy edited at the moment, and it's a collaboration where I was the co-author with a friend of mine in prison, where he has 2 life sentences for murder, and he has written a series of essays and then poems about his reflections on living his life in prison, and the book is called Secrets from a Prison Cell. And that hopefully will be out in the next few months. And so that project is coming out. And then, of course, I have the other book that I'm working on that I mentioned to you before, which is the longer version of the kind of Cracks of Hope. It's the stories and lessons that I've learned from that travel in Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, and South Africa. And so I tell these stories about people who have lived their lives in divided societies in deeply violent areas, and yet have found ways and are finding ways to transcend those conflicts. And I want to hold those stories up as I say, the stories that might save us, to say, look, we're in a time of deep division, but guess what? People have been living with this kind of division worse for a long time, and they have found ways to reach for each other in the midst of their division. And we need to be lifting up these stories. And then I also will be looking in that book at the ideas of reconciliation and justice, and that too often people try to pit those against each other to say, well, we either need to be working on reconciling and building relationships, or we need to be doing the work of justice and, working on taking down oppressive systems and structures. And, and if you're a really big justice person, you can often look with skepticism on people who are doing relationship building. And if you're really into relationship building, you can think that people are misplaced in their passions on justice. And what I want to emphasize to folks is that it is dangerous to pit them against each other, because neither of those ideas, neither of those concepts and those practices can survive without the other. That you cannot build sustainable, healthy relationships if you have oppressive structures keeping you apart. And you won't be able to keep those oppressive structures from returning once you take them down if you're not also building relationships that, healthy, sustainable relationships. And so both these pursuits have to go together. And so those are the writing projects that I'm currently working on. I'm also developing a few more ebooks that I'll give away for free to those who want to follow my website, michaelmcrae.com. You can get access to those as they come out. And then I'm, again, just working on building Narrative 4 programs around Tennessee, and I do some of that work internationally as well. I lead tours to Israel and Palestine. I'm actually leading one in 2019. Again, all that information is on my website, where we take people on Christian pilgrimages to Israel and Palestine, but we also introduce them to the peace builders on the ground, and we take them into the West Bank, and we really show them eyewitness experiences about the conflict. And then I do talks. I'm flying back to TCU in Fort Worth next week to do be part of a 2-day program on stories of reconciliation and lessons of reconciliation from around the world. And I'm working with people from Bosnia and Herzegovina on that. And so yeah, just kind of, I got my fingers in a lot of different pies. And I also teach as an adjunct at Lipscomb University. I teach on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I teach on international conflict resolution. And so just lots of stuff, kind of piecing it together all over the place. So
yeah. For real. Wow, the pilgrimage thing. I wasn't aware of that one. That's something that I've always wanted to do. That's found on your Facebook page, the information for that, did you say?
No, it's just go to michaelmcrae.com, and there's a tab that says Israel Palestine Tours, and you can find out some information there. And I lead those with my uncle, who's a lifelong minister, and we are currently trying to finalize the brochure that we'll make available, but there's a lot of information already available on my website. And when you go to my website, for those who are listening, you'll immediately be prompted to enter your email address. And when you do that, you'll automatically be sent this free ebook that Maggie mentioned, The Cracks of Hope. And then you can stay informed with updates about the tour and any other ebooks that will come out for free. So I would encourage you, if you wish, to go to michaelmcrae.com and just put your email address in there and get a lot of stuff for free.
Wow, that is so cool. I want to go back, if we could, just to your prison experiences. Now, you started off doing volunteer work and then ended up being a prison chaplain for an intermittent period, right?
That's right.
Okay. So when you heard these stories, obviously the prayers at the end were guided. They were given to you by the Holy Spirit. That's just incredible to me. I love when I get that feeling and I'm guided to share something that I believe will help other people. My question for you specifically, though, is when you first started out volunteering at the prison, how did you broach spirituality with people who maybe have never known about Jesus, or that Jesus even existed, or maybe at some point in their life had felt like Jesus had given up on them, and so they went down a different road? Did you approach it person to person, just open yourself up and talk to them, and you mentioned earlier gain their trust, so that's kind of where I was going with that, and then broach the spirituality? Or did you approach that kind of on the front burner as well? And if you did, I wonder what kind of pushback, I guess I'd say, that you had received that way. What was your tactic? What was your approach?
Yeah, I mean, actually, my answer may be somewhat disappointing to you. Just that my particular chaplaincy work actually didn't have much to do at all with those kinds of conversations, simply because the unit that I was on was kind of nonstop 24/7 crisis unit. These are people who are kept in solitary confinement for what they call 23-1. That's 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. They are locked in solitary confinement. Now, the United Nations has said, and I believe I'm correct about this, that 18 days in solitary confinement constitutes psychological torture. And there are men there's at least, I can think of one man in particular at Riverbend Prison here in Nashville who's been in solitary confinement for at least 14 years. So these are men who have become, especially at this point, very mentally unstable. They're deeply broken. They're being broken more and more by the system. And so much of my work was just trying to de-escalate the violence. And a lot of that is just through listening. So if men wanted to talk about their faith or their lack of faith, I would listen. I would offer, questions or comments where I could. But the task that I was given by the head chaplain was not to do any kind of evangelism. It wasn't even really to be some kind of spiritual counselor. It was to de-escalate as much violence as I could and to try to make these men feel heard. And so that's what I did. There were occasions where people wanted to talk about theology. I mean, I remember one of the most poignant and one of the shortest conversations that I remember having was a man he was in solitary and he was just so deeply broken. And I'm talking to these men mostly through huge steel doors with very thin glass windows. And I could just see part of his face through the window. And he was speaking to me through the crack in the door. And he said, "Chaplain, I got 2 questions for you. Do you think Jesus wants me to be here in this prison? And if he doesn't, do you think he'll get me out?" And I looked at him and just said, with all the honesty I had, I said, no and no is basically where my answer is. No, I don't think Jesus wants you here. And no, I don't think Jesus is going to get you out. And so, I don't know what he ended up doing with that, to wrestle with that theology, to say, well, what does it mean then if God doesn't want me here, but God's not going to bust me out of the prison? What does that mean? And I don't have answers for that stuff. And so I didn't see my job as trying to give any kind of answers on spirituality or answers on theology. My job was just to be as present as I could for men who have been abandoned by their society, and often abandoned even by their families and friends. I mean, men who have been in solitary for years, and one guy in particular had been in there for 4 or 5 years, and he had never received a single visitor in 4 or 5 years in solitary confinement. I mean, and so talking about Jesus really isn't, it's not their top plate issue. For some of them it is. And I remember one person just talking about how convinced he was that he was going to go to hell because he was in there for a rape of a child, and talking about that he knew there was no way that God could ever love him, and I tried to have conversations about the mercy and grace of God, but he was deeply disturbed and just couldn't wrap his head around it, and he was constantly harming himself. And so that's the kind of stuff that it takes years, I think, of building those relationships to get to a place where you can really make headway with, if your goal is to try and get people to embrace God. I mean, if that's what your goal might be as a chaplain, then it often takes years of building trust for that. And unfortunately, I only had a year before I was kicked out of the prison. But again, like I said, that wasn't my particular focus. It's the focus of a lot of chaplains, but it wasn't my focus. So.
Wow, very interesting perspective. How did you stop them from harming themselves? When you say de-escalation, it was more psychological than the approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's so. One of the tactics of violence de-escalation is just mirroring the behavior that you want to see. And so when men would have razors and be holding it to their arms, threatening to cut themselves, and screaming and horse kicking their doors, if I came in there, yelling at them, you got to calm down, everybody could. It's not going to help anything. And so I would just stand at their door and say, hey, Mr. Jackson, talk to me about what's going on. Why are you holding that razor there? And, he'd be yelling still. And I would just listen to him and make eye contact and maintain a soft and caring tone. And over time, sometimes it takes 10, 15 minutes, their energy calms down and they start to mirror what they're seeing in you. And so, so some things like that, and the basic, most powerful, I think, tactic of nonviolence is just listening. It's as simple as that. Like, I've studied international conflict at even at a master's level, and one of the things that you learn really quickly is that one of the most effective ways to get people to be violent is to make them feel unheard. If that's on a macro level, like in Israel, Palestine, or Northern Ireland, and one group feels like they're not being represented, they don't have a voice, they're not being heard, they will find a way to be heard, and it usually becomes more violent. And the same thing's true even on a personal level, that a lot of these men in prison, they would have requests from guards or administration for certain things, but they would be ignored, they would be scoffed, they would be dismissed. And so they would find ways to be heard. And that would usually be by harming themselves, because then under, prison code or law, that they'd have to at least get medical attention, and they could at least get someone into their cell. And so it was just, It was just listening. A lot of it. It's really just quite that simple. It was making sure that they felt heard, and that they felt like somebody actually cared about what they had to say. And that takes a while to convince people. And you can see one of the first stories that I tell at the back of the book is one of my first days on the job, where a guy almost died when he almost bled to death in front of me. And we had this interaction where he just was like, "I don't know you. I don't believe for a second that you care about me." And it was a traumatic experience. And so it was just trying to make sure that they felt that there was a caring presence in that prison, even if I was the only one.
And it's ironic to me that, and that's exactly the reason that you got kicked out, right? For trying to advocate.
That's right.
Wow.
Yep.
And that's exactly what's wrong with our system, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
Oh, well. So tell me now, what would you suggest for the rookie, let's say, when we come across these problems on the street, with the interracial problems going on in America and these stories of Antifa, things like that? What would you suggest? Obviously listening and being empathetic. I know that in your stories you talk about approaching prisoners and trying to make friends with them, and one of your peers or friends offered a piece of birthday cake to the soldier.
Israeli soldier.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything that you would suggest particularly? Just, should we as normal citizens approach these people and just try and be friendly with them and make peace with them and let them realize that we have human qualities just as they do and we're all one? Listen to their stories, try and get them to talk. What do you think would be the most effective for all of us? Something that we could use in our daily approach, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one to answer, because it's all very complicated. And part of the reason it's complicated is because it's very situational, right? There's no one tactic for every situation. And so the first thing is to be wise. If you see people on the streets with guns, be careful about just running in the middle of it and trying to get them to talk. You might find yourself dead. So you want to be you want to be wise in the way that you handle it. But I think the degree that we can get people to have conversations together, words are always preferable to guns and to clubs and to knives, or to driving over people with our cars, like in Charlottesville. And so I think, we want to build conversations as much as we can. And we want to, the thing I learned with Christian peacemaker teams is the word that we always kept in the front of our minds was de-escalate, 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 de-escalate. And you just got to do what's practical there. And so, using things like, mirroring a calmer energy, doing the unexpected. That's always a big one. One of the stories I tell in Letters from Apartheid Street was about when I walked out of the old city of Hebron and walked through an Israeli checkpoint, and an Israeli soldier came up to me and got right up in my face. He was fully, had all of his gear on, and he was holding a semi-automatic rifle, and got right up in my face. And he told me that, the organization I was with was garbage, and I was garbage. And, he looked very angry. And obviously I was quite tense because I'm unarmed. And but I remembered this tactic in nonviolence about doing the unexpected. And so I just looked at him and I said, do you watch tennis? And of course he looked really startled, and he kind of, looked inquisitively at me, and I was like, tennis, do you watch tennis? And And I said, I'm asking because you look a lot like Novak Djokovic, who is at the time, and I think still is, the number one ranked tennis player in the world. And so he turned to some of his other soldiers and were speaking Hebrew and stuff, and he didn't speak a whole lot of English. And so one of the other soldiers said, well, he thinks you look like Novak Djokovic. And I had a really thick beard at the time, and I was like, there's no way, my beard is way too thick. And so we ended up just standing there laughing and talking about tennis and different celebrities and stuff. And so, in one moment where he's in my face with a gun, and by doing something unexpected and by not playing the role that he wanted for me, which was the intimidated victim who's scared of this armed soldier, when I refused to play that role, we were able to shift the energy of the encounter and de-escalate that situation. Doesn't always work, but because all of it's a risk. You never know what's going to work. There's no recipe for it. And so, but I think, what we really need to be working on also is building systems of justice. We are much less likely to want to harm each other if we would live in a more just society. So looking at what are the systems that are keeping us from apart, what are the systems that are keeping some people down and are pushing other people up to the top? What are because you can look at the statistics from a lot of different countries, that countries with the lowest rates of wealth inequality, for instance, have the lowest rates of homicide, right? The least violent societies are the ones that have the least, the smallest gaps between the rich and the poor. And so, really being active and saying, if we want to create more peaceful societies, we have to create societies that are healthier, that are more just, that are not keeping people down, that are not favoring some over others. And so and that's long-term stuff, right? That's the long-term game, is building those more just societies. And in terms of the individual encounters, again, it's very situational. But I think doing everything that you can to be a de-escalating presence, to not go in with high anxious energy that is going to stir up the shouting matches, that's going to stir up people wanting to attack others with their guns and their knives, but finding a way to be in solidarity with people who are suffering and to be a presence that is trying to facilitate more transformative encounters between people.
Wonderful answer. Wonderful.
Thanks.
What would you say is the most pressing issue? What would you say that as a country we need to focus on first and foremost of all of the topics that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest crisis facing the country, and this is an unpopular thing to say, I would imagine, but I think the biggest crisis is the crisis of white supremacy. I do truly believe that the narrative, and this comes back to stories, right? There's been a story in this country for a very, very long time that white people are superior to other people who are not white. And that is what allowed us to have slaves. It is what allowed us to then have convict. Once we ended slavery, we then transformed our racism into convict leasing, where we could arrest people, and then part of their sentence would be to work the fields. And so even though that people couldn't legally have slaves, they then just increased all the different crimes that they could think of and made everything a crime, so that more black people would go back to prison, and then they could go back to working the land. And then once convict leasing ended, we came up with Jim Crow laws and lynching. And then once those ended, we transformed into a system of mass incarceration. And the reason it keeps being reinvented is because we've never dealt with the narrative of white supremacy. We've never seriously challenged the belief that white people are a superior race. And this is what the Nazis believe. It's why we have neo-Nazis coming back, right? We're coming back with people who say white lives matter. It's about white nationalism. It's a white country, walking in Charlottesville, holding signs that say, "You will not replace us." Putting the white back in the White House, people said after Obama, right? Literally put the white back in the White House. And I think that this is the cardinal sin of the United States, is the sin of white supremacy. And I think that especially white people, I don't know what your demographic is for your listeners, but if it's mostly white people, then we have got to take this seriously, because white supremacy has enslaved and brutalized and lynched and killed people for the entire history of this country. Excuse me. And we've got to take that seriously. Sorry, my throat just went out.
It's okay. 'Tis the season. Everybody in this area is sick as well.
Apologies.
Oh.
But
No
I do
problem.
think that's we really got to work on that, and to try and for me it's about facilitating those transformative encounters. It's working to divest from the privileges that we just instinctively have as white people, and trying to find ways to make the country more just for this Muslim woman that was in my narrative 4-story exchange, who came here top of her field. She was being flown all around the world when she lived in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt, with a PhD and esteemed in her field. And she came to this country because her daughters were ready for college and they wanted to make a better life for their children. And she has not been able to get a job because of her, because she's a conservative Muslim woman wearing a hijab. And is continually turned away from employment. And she talked about how deeply betrayed by this country that she feels, because the narrative that the United States exports is one that says it's the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your people yearning to be free. Like, send them here. And people come here, and then they're often met with deep racism and fear and anger, and people saying, go back to where you came from, which is the exact opposite of what the United States has said that it is about. And I think that's the one of the largest crises that we have to deal with, is challenging this myth that white people are somehow better than everybody else. And again, I know that a lot of folks are tired of hearing about that, but that doesn't mean we need to stop talking about it. I think it's one of the most important things that we do need to deal with.
Very, very interesting response. Very, very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have about maybe 6 minutes left. We'd like to promote, obviously, your website, www.michaelmccrae.com, right?
Yeah.
And if you'd like to go ahead, please, and just give the titles of your books and where people can find them, and just anything that you'd like to share in closing. I'd really be happy to hear whatever it is that you have to say.
Yeah. So again, for those listening, if you go to, excuse me, ma'am, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, at Michael McCrae. I have a Facebook public figure page. You can like me on there. And then you can go to my website, michaelmccrae.com. Again, when you go there, you'll immediately be prompted to download that ebook. So I encourage you to do that. And you can then you can read a lot more about the writing that I do, the narrative 4 stuff, 10 by 9, my Israel and Palestine tours. You can see some videos of different talks that I've given or stories that I've told at 10 by 9. So sorry. And I didn't bring any water with me into this room. But you can find my books on my website, but you can also go to Amazon.com and type in my name, Michael T. McCrae, and you'll find Letters from Apartheid Street there. And you'll also find Where the River Bends. And hopefully in a few months, you'll find Secrets from a Prison Cell. So I welcome you to do that. But if you want to stay up to date with when my next projects come out, then the best way to do that is to go to my website and subscribe, so you can get those emails. And I'll tell folks that I'm actually I'm in the process of developing I'm really excited about this, an Advent reader that's going to go out obviously during the season of Advent, which I think this year starts on December the 3rd. And I have gathered a series of really amazing, or a group of really amazing writers. I have black and white theologians, peace builders, and poets, and people from Ireland and Australia and South Africa, Christian figures like Shane Claiborne and Brian McLaren and, Naomi Tutu, one of the daughters of Desmond Tutu, and, Irish theologian Padraig Otuma, and just some amazing people that will be giving this Advent reader away for free. And people can subscribe to my website, and they'll get this Advent reader sent to them every day with a new reflection from a different writer. And so I would encourage folks to do that as well. And I think that, I guess in closing, what I would tell folks is to continue to be aware of the dangers of single stories. And what I mean by that is a Nigerian novelist named Chimamanda Adichie had an absolutely brilliant TED Talk. You can find it on YouTube. It's one of the most watched TED Talks ever. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And what she says is that single stories are stories that depict only one side to a person or an event, and that these stories often create stereotypes. So for instance, many of these single stories that we tell now are that immigrants are dangerous, immigrants are taking our jobs, Muslims are terrorists, these types of single stories that we tell. And she says the problem with stereotypes is not necessarily that they're untrue. The problem is that they're incomplete. There's always more to these stories. And what I would encourage folks to do is to really cultivate an awareness of where are single stories being told in your life. Where are you hearing them in American society, or if you're elsewhere in the world, where are you hearing them in your cultures? Where are these stereotypes being pushed, and why are they being pushed? And to really devote your time and attention to searching out the rest of those stories. There's always more to the story. And what is it that we can learn about ourselves and about the person that we might call the other, by searching out these other stories, because I think single stories are one of the quickest ways to get to dehumanization, because human beings are deeply complex. And when we only allow ourselves to tell a single story about each other, we are simplifying each other to the point that we really aren't even human anymore. And when we dehumanize each other, it becomes much easier to think about getting rid of that person. And so I just want to encourage all of us to continue to be on the lookout for single stories, and to invest in lifting up and searching out the stories of people who are often miscategorized, who are misrepresented and misheard, and doing our best to humble ourselves and listen. Thanks for having me on.
I love that. No, thanks so very much for joining us today and sharing your stories and perspectives with that. And I love that closing statement, because I absolutely feel in mainstream media that things are most definitely slanted, and we are only getting one side of the picture. We're not hearing these stories that we really need to dig deeper for, to be able to recognize someone else's perspective and understand what they're going through, and having empathy and compassion as human beings and as fellow, just children of God. It's so important. Thank you so much for joining us today, Michael.
Yes. Thank you, Maggie.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I wish you all of the continued success. And I encourage everybody to go to your website, check out that book, Cracks of Hope, buy his other books. I absolutely myself will be buying them very shortly here. I want to check this stuff out. It's amazing to me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and absolutely. And God bless you. Thanks for all you're doing. Really
you as well.
Making a huge difference. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.